Carl Jung, a name synonymous with the deepest dives into the human psyche, he uncovered something that would forever alter our understanding of narcissism. It's not always about blatant abuse or outright neglect. The core wound that shapes a narcissistic personality often hides in the shadows. It's far more subtle, almost invisible, and that makes it all the more destructive. It happens in those pivotal moments when a child cries out for comfort, and instead of receiving nurturing, they encounter emotional abandonment. In that instant, that moment of utter vulnerability, when a child desperately needs connection, the maternal response etches something profound onto their developing psychological structure. Jung realized that when this response is one of rejection or invalidation, it doesn't just sting, it causes a catastrophic fragmentation of the self, a split so deep that the child literally buries a part of themselves just to survive emotionally. That part of the child that feels, that needs, that's vulnerable. That part is banished to the shadow, and in its place, an adaptive persona takes over. A false self, quickly learning the cardinal rule of survival. Your emotional needs are unacceptable. Your vulnerability is a flaw. Your tears are a failure that must be eliminated. And so it is, in that seemingly small moment, in that maternal response to a child's cry, that the narcissistic structure is born, a rigid defense against the unbearable pain of being rejected at your most basic human level. This video will peel back the layers, revealing the unseen mechanism through which this happens. How invalidating a child's tears leads to emotional dissociation. How abandonment in moments of vulnerability breeds toxic shame around feeling. How the message that crying is unacceptable morphs into compulsive self-sufficiency, emotional coldness, and an inability to even access true needs. We're going to explore not just what's on the surface, but the profound Jungian process unfolding within the child's psyche. And if you recognize your own childhood in this dynamic, if you feel that familiar ache as you hear these words, know that you are not alone. And understanding this pattern is the first step towards breaking the cycle, because narcissism isn't who you are. It's the armor you forged when you were too young to know there were other ways to survive. Hold on to that idea about the fragmentation of the self, because in a few minutes, I'm going to pinpoint the exact moment that split occurs, and you'll likely recognize it in your own story. Picture a 5-year-old girl. Let's call her Emily. Emily has just fallen in the playground. Her knee is bleeding a little, but the physical pain isn't the worst part. It's the fright, the feeling of helplessness, the fear that washes over her small body. She runs to her mother, tears streaming down her face, seeking not just physical comfort, but something much deeper, emotional validation. The unspoken message she needs to hear is, your pain matters, your feelings are real, you are safe with me. But that's not what happens. Emily's mother looks at her with an expression the little girl can't yet name, but her body registers completely. It's a mixture of irritation, embarrassment, impatience. And then comes the phrase Emily will hear hundreds of times throughout her childhood, in different variations, but always with the same core message. It's nothing. Stop making such a fuss. In that moment, something invisible but devastating occurs within Emily's psyche. Jung would call it a moment of self-fragmentation, because what Emily is feeling is real. The pain is real. The fright is real. The fear is real. But the person she trusts most in the universe, the person who defines her emotional reality, is telling her that what she feels doesn't exist. This isn't just invalidation. It's a form of deep emotional gaslighting. It's a denial of the child's psychic reality. And the child has no way to process this contradiction between what they feel internally and what they're being told about their own feelings. The only way to survive psychologically is to believe their mother and disbelieve themselves. So Emily does what all children in this position do. She buries the part of herself that feels. She pushes the vulnerability, the sensitivity, the need for nurturing into the shadow, and in place of that authentic part, she constructs an adaptive persona, a false Emily, who doesn't cry, who doesn't need, who doesn't feel. And in that exact moment, the primary narcissistic wound is being created. But hold on, because what I'm about to reveal about the repetition of this invalidation pattern will help you understand why the wound runs so deep. This wasn't an isolated incident for Emily. It was the start of a systematic pattern. At 6 years old, when she cries because her teacher reprimanded her unfairly, her mother says, "You're exaggerating." At 7, when she cries because her father forgot his promise to take her to the park, she hears, "Stop being so sensitive." At 8, when she cries because her best friend excluded her, she receives, "It's nothing. You're making a mountain out of a molehill." Each time Emily expresses vulnerability through tears, each time she seeks emotional validation, she receives the same core message in different variations. What you feel isn't legitimate. Your emotions are overblown. Your sensitivity is a defect. Your crying is manipulation, weakness, unnecessary drama. And Jung knew that when a child receives this message repeatedly, especially from the maternal figure who should be the primary source of emotional mirroring, something catastrophic happens in the development of the self. The child doesn't just learn not to cry. They learn something much deeper and much more destructive. They learn not to feel, because crying is just the external expression of something internal. And when that expression is systematically punished or invalidated, the only way to avoid punishment is to cut off access to the source. Emily can't control the crying if she continues to feel the pain, so she has to stop feeling the pain. And it's exactly here that emotional dissociation sets in as a survival mechanism. By 10 years old, Emily no longer cries. People praise her for it. What a mature girl. Such impressive self-control. So different from those other dramatic children. Her mother is proud. Finally, her daughter has gotten over that irritating, sensitive phase. But what really happened wasn't overcoming. It was psychological assassination. The part of Emily that felt, that needed, that was vulnerable, didn't grow. It was silenced, repressed, banished to the shadow. And in its place, a false self took control. A performative Emily who learned to function without access to her own feelings. And here's the crucial Jungian insight that most people miss. This false Emily, this adaptive persona, isn't narcissism yet. It's the defense against something far more unbearable. It's a defense against the pain of being rejected in your essential humanity. Narcissism comes later. It arrives as the compensatory structure, built upon that primary wound, because when you bury the part of yourself that needs others, when you suppress the vulnerability that seeks connection, when you dissociate from your own feelings to avoid rejection, you create a deep psychological void, an existential loneliness that Carl Jung called alienation from the true self. And that void needs to be filled with something. That's when narcissistic inflation comes in. Emily, at 15, develops a grandiose persona. She's the best student, the most competent, the one who never fails, the one who doesn't need anyone. She constructs an inflated self-image, not because she loves herself too much, but because she needs to compensate for the fact that, deep down in the shadow, there's a 5-year-old girl who's still waiting to be seen, validated, nurtured in her vulnerability. Emily's narcissism isn't an excess of self-love. It's a desperate defense against the terror of returning to that moment in the playground, to that feeling of crying and discovering that her pain doesn't matter, that her feelings aren't real, that her vulnerability is defective. Just wait. Because what I'm about to reveal about the generational transmission of this pattern will make you see your own family in a completely different light. When Emily is 28, she becomes a mother. And one afternoon, her 4-year-old daughter falls and starts to cry, and Emily feels something disturbing rise in her chest, an inexplicable irritation, a visceral discomfort with the child's crying, an almost compulsive urgency to make that sound stop. And before she can even process what she's doing, the words come out of her mouth with an eerie familiarity. It's nothing. Stop making a mountain out of a molehill. The same words, the same tone, the same energy. Emily has just become her own mother. She's just replicated, completely unconsciously, the exact pattern that fragmented her own self in childhood. And this doesn't happen because Emily is bad, or because she consciously chose to perpetuate the trauma. It happens because she never integrated the shadow, never rescued that 5-year-old girl who was buried alive, never did the Jungian work of recognizing, feeling, and reintegrating the part of her that was rejected. According to Carl Jung's theories, so that part remains in the shadow, and in the shadow, it becomes an autonomous complex, an unconscious pattern that activates automatically in specific situations, especially when Emily is confronted with the vulnerability of her own daughter. Because seeing her daughter cry isn't just seeing a child expressing emotion. To Emily's unconscious, it's seeing a mirror of her own repressed vulnerability. It's being confronted with the part of herself that's still wounded, still waiting for validation, still needing to be nurtured in the crying she never could fully express. And the unintegrated unconscious does what it always does. It repeats the pattern, projects onto her daughter the same treatment she received, perpetuates the wound for the next generation. This is what Jung called the generational transmission of the complex. And it's absolutely terrifying to realize that most narcissistic parents have no idea that they're doing this. They genuinely believe they're teaching their children to be strong, resilient, not dramatic. But what they're really doing is transmitting their own unhealed wound. Hold on to that about autonomous complexes, because in a few minutes, I'm going to reveal exactly how to recognize when you're acting from the wound instead of acting from the conscious self. Based on the work of Carl Jung, when Emily, at 5 years old, hears for the first time that her pain isn't real, something happens that Jung would describe as an impossible choice: maintain the connection with her own internal experience, or maintain the connection with the maternal figure, the source of survival. For a 5-year-old child, there is no real choice. The mother is literally the definer of reality. When she says that what Emily feels isn't real, Emily can't simply disagree, because maintaining her internal truth would mean losing her mother. And losing her mother, on a deep psychological level, means death. So Emily unconsciously chooses survival. She sacrifices the connection with her true self to maintain the connection with her mother. She kills a part of herself to keep the relationship alive. And that's exactly what creates the fundamental narcissistic split. On one side, in consciousness, there's an adaptive Emily who receives conditional approval. On the other side, in the shadow, there's the true Emily, vulnerable and human, judged unacceptable. And the more time passes, The more rigid this division becomes, until Emily completely loses conscious access to her true self. And here, something happens that Jung considered the fundamental tragedy of the human psyche: total identification with the persona. When Emily reaches 25, she no longer has any conscious memory of that 5-year-old girl in the playground. She doesn't remember the exact moment of fragmentation. That specific scene might even be erased from conscious memory. But the pattern is engraved in her body, in her emotional reflexes, in her character structure. Carl Jung would say, this is buried in the unconsciousness. Emily, as an adult, describes herself as strong, independent, self-sufficient. She prides herself on not needing anyone, on not crying, on having emotional control. When people say she's cold, she interprets it as a compliment. It means she's not weak like other people, dramatic and needy. But there are moments when something strange happens, moments when the division shows, moments when the shadow tries to emerge. Emily has been in a relationship for 2 years. One night, after an argument, her partner tries to approach her emotionally. He says something simple, but deeply connected. "I know you're hurt. It's okay to feel that. I'm here." And Emily feels something terrifying happen in her chest. Something is rising, something that was buried long ago. It's a feeling of vulnerability so intense that her nervous system interprets it as a life-threatening threat. Her body goes into fight or flight mode. And before she can process what's happening, the narcissistic defense activates automatically. Emily freezes emotionally. Her eyes go blank, her voice becomes cold, and she says, with a cruelty that surprises even herself, "You're making a mountain out of a molehill. I'm fine. Stop projecting your emotional needs onto me." She just did to her partner exactly what her mother did to her, invalidated his emotional perception, denied her own vulnerability, used coldness as a defense against connection. And the saddest part is that Emily genuinely believes she's being rational, that she's protecting herself from emotional dependency, that she's maintaining healthy boundaries. She doesn't realize that what she's really doing is perpetuating the cycle of the wound. She's using that narcissistic armor to avoid the one thing that could actually heal her, being seen and nurtured in her true vulnerability. 3 months later, the partner ends the relationship. He says something that will haunt Emily. "I love you, but I can't love someone who isn't willing to be human with me." And for the first time in years, something cracks in Emily's armor. She feels a pain that she can't dissociate from, can't intellectualize, can't perform away. It's an old, primitive pain that comes from a place so deep, she doesn't even know what to call it. That night, alone, Emily cries, and as she cries, something extraordinary happens. For an instant, the division dissolves. For a moment, she isn't the performative, strong, self-sufficient Emily. She's just a 5-year-old girl who fell on the playground and needed some nurturing. And for the first time in her adult life, Emily feels something that Jung would call the beginning of individuation, the moment when the persona starts to crack and the true self tries to emerge. But the path of individuation isn't linear. It's not a one-time revelation that cures everything. It's a long, painful process of recognizing, feeling, and reintegrating the parts that were buried. And that brings us to a crucial point about recovery that needs to be said with total clarity. You don't overcome the primary narcissistic wound by ignoring it. You don't heal dissociation with more dissociation. You don't integrate the shadow by keeping it in the shadow. The only way to heal this wound is to do exactly what was forbidden in childhood. Feel completely, cry without stopping, need without punishing yourself for needing, be vulnerable without building defenses against vulnerability. And that's terrifying, because it means going back to the moment of the primary wound. It means feeling that pain of discovering that your crying wasn't validated, that your vulnerability was judged as defective, that your emotional needs were treated as unacceptable. It means mourning for what never was, for the childhood you should have had, for the mother who should have held you while you cried, instead of shaming you for it, for the nurturing that was your basic right as a vulnerable child. And only after feeling this pain completely, only after validating the experience of that 5-year-old, does it become possible to reintegrate the shadow, to rescue the part of you that feels, that needs, that is vulnerable, and to discover that this part isn't weakness. It's your essential humanity. But there's a detail about this healing process that very few people understand, and that's what I'm going to reveal now. The recovery from the narcissistic wound created by the invalidation of crying doesn't happen only on a cognitive level. It's not enough to intellectually understand that your mother was wrong, that your feelings were valid, that you had the right to cry. Because the wound wasn't created on the cognitive level, it was created on the somatic, corporal, pre-verbal level. It happened even before you had words to name what you were feeling, so the healing also needs to happen on that deep level. Emily, 2 years after the breakup, is in deep therapy. That includes somatic work. In one session, the therapist asks Emily to feel where in her body she holds the prohibition against crying. Emily feels it immediately. It's in her throat, a chronic, invisible tension. When she relaxes that tension, something old begins to rise. It's a cry that comes from a place she hasn't accessed in decades. It's not adult crying, it's child crying. The crying that could never be fully cried, and for the first time since she was 5, Emily cries unstoppably, without controlling herself, without building defenses. She cries the grief of 20 years of dissociation. She cries the loneliness of having lived identified with a false persona. And something extraordinary happens. The therapist doesn't invalidate, doesn't minimize, doesn't abandon. She just validates. What you're feeling is real. Your pain matters. You are safe here. Emily experiences for the first time what Jung would call reparenting, the experience of being nurtured in her vulnerability as instead of rejected, and it's this experience that begins to undo the narcissistic split, because the narcissistic wound wasn't created by a single rejection. It was created by the systematic repetition of invalidation. So the healing also doesn't happen in a single moment of nurturing. It needs the systematic repetition of validation. Emily will need to cry many times, will need to feel vulnerability many times, will need to tolerate the terrifying sensation of being seen in her raw humanity many times. Each time reinforcing the new message: you can feel and still be lovable. You can need and still be worthy. You can cry and still be human, not defective. And each time that new experience is reinforced, the narcissistic split weakens a little. The identification with the false persona loosens a little. The access to the true self expands a little. Until, eventually, Emily isn't living from the narcissistic armor anymore. She's living from the integrated self. But here's the part that might sound harsh, but that needs to be said with complete honesty. This process isn't optional if you want true relationships. if you want real intimacy, if you want to stop transmitting the wound to the next generation. You can live your whole life in the narcissistic persona. You can function in the world. You can even have external success, but you'll live in the deep existential loneliness of never being seen for who you really are. Because who you really are is buried in the shadow. And the price of keeping the shadow repressed is the inability to have authentic connection. So the question you need to ask yourself is, are you willing to feel the pain of the primary wound, to have access to your true humanity, or will you continue choosing the safety of the armor at the cost of real connection? Because that's the choice that the narcissistic wound, created by the invalidation of crying, forces you to make. And there's no right or wrong answer. There are just different consequences. And now, after revealing this profound process of how the invalidation of crying creates the narcissistic wound, of showing the path from fragmentation to possible integration, I need to pause to say something important. If this video resonated with something deep within you, if you recognized your own story and Emily's, if you felt that familiar pain of having your crying invalidated in childhood, you've just received something that most people will never have access to, the truth about how your narcissistic structure was created, and more importantly, the real possibility of healing it. This information isn't just knowledge. It's the key to breaking generational cycles. It's the map to rescuing parts of yourself that were buried decades ago. It's permission to finally feel what you were forbidden to feel, and producing this kind of content. This depth of Jungian analysis applied to the formation of narcissism demands something beyond just time. It requires a deep study of Jung, a comprehension of child development, research on generational trauma, and the courage to speak truths that many would rather not hear. Few channels do this work because it's easier to offer quick fixes, superficial diagnoses, and simple blame shifting onto the parents. But the truth is more complex and much more liberating. Your parents weren't monsters. They were transmitting unhealed wounds, and you're not doomed to repeat the pattern. You can consciously choose to break it. If this video has given you that clarity, if it's offered you this map toward healing, the super thanks button right below isn't just financial support. It's you saying this truth about the formation of narcissism needs to continue being revealed. Other people who grew up having their cries invalidated need to know that the wound can be healed. When you click that golden heart, you're investing in breaking generational cycles of emotional trauma. You're not just a spectator. You're a conscious survivor who is choosing to do things differently, become part of those who are bringing to light the familiar shadows that have been kept in the dark for generations. And now, let's move on to the final part. But perhaps the most important, the signs that you're starting to heal this wound, how to recognize that integration is happening. Emily, at 35, is in a very different place from where she started. The journey hasn't been linear. There have been relapses. There have been moments when the narcissistic defense came back with full force. There have been relationships that ended because she still couldn't tolerate vulnerability. There have been nights of solitude so deep that she almost gave up on the process. But she continued in therapy, continued feeling, continued confronting the moments when she wanted to dissociate instead of feeling, continued choosing repeatedly vulnerability instead of armor. And little by little, signs of integration began to appear. The first sign was subtle. One day, Emily is watching a movie, and an emotional scene makes her cry. And instead of the automatic reaction of feeling ashamed, of stopping the crying, of judging herself for making a fuss, she just lets the tears fall. And while she cries, she thinks, This is human. This isn't weakness. This is connection with my own soul. That thought doesn't seem revolutionary, but for someone who spent 20 years dissociated from their feelings, it's transformative. It's evidence that the division is healing, that the true self is being reintegrated. The second sign happens in a new relationship. Emily's been dating someone for 3 months, and one night, after an argument, she feels that familiar impulse to freeze emotionally, to activate the defensive coldness, to invalidate her own pain. But this time, something different happens. She recognizes the pattern. She sees the armor trying to rise, and she makes a conscious choice not to activate the defense. Instead, she takes a deep breath and says something that she's never been able to say before. I'm hurt. And I'm afraid to tell you this, because when I was a child, my pain was treated as making a mountain out of a molehill. But I'm choosing to trust that you won't do what my mother did, and her partner doesn't invalidate her, doesn't minimize her. He comes closer and says, "Thank you for trusting me with that. Your pain matters." And for the first time, Emily experiences real intimacy, not performative, not transactional, real, and discovers that being seen in her vulnerability doesn't kill her. In fact, it's the opposite. It makes her feel alive for the first time in decades. The third sign, and perhaps the most important, happens when Emily becomes a mother for the second time. She already has that 4-year-old daughter with whom she replicated the toxic pattern. But now, 7 years later, she has a baby. And one afternoon, the baby is crying inconsolably. And Emily feels that familiar irritation starting to rise, that urgency to make the crying stop. But this time, she recognizes it. She sees the autonomous complex trying to activate. She identifies, this isn't about the baby. This is about my own unintegrated wound being activated. And instead of acting from the complex, she breathes. She consciously connects with the integrated self. And she picks up the baby and says something that she never heard when she was a child. It's okay to cry. Your feelings are real. I'm here with you. And while rocking the baby, Emily realizes that she's healing 2 people at the same time. The baby who is being nurtured, and the 5-year-old girl inside her who is finally hearing the words she needed to hear. This is the moment when the generational transmission of trauma is interrupted. Not because Emily has become perfect, not because she never feels the wound again, but because she's developed enough awareness to recognize when she's acting from the wound and choose intentionally to act from the integrated self. And that baby will grow up with a completely different message about vulnerability. Will learn that crying is human, not defective, that feeling is strength, not weakness, that asking for nurturing is legitimate, not shameful, and will develop an integrated self instead of a fragmented one. Will have access to her own vulnerability without needing to build narcissistic armor. Will be able to achieve real intimacy because she never learned that needing others is unacceptable. That's the power of breaking the cycle consciously. But there's something crucial that needs to be said about this process. The healing of the narcissistic wound created by the invalidation of crying doesn't mean that you'll never feel the wound again. It means that you've developed the ability to be with the wound without being controlled by it, to recognize when it's activated without automatically acting from the defensive pattern. Emily, even at 40, still has moments when the wound gets activated, moments when someone invalidates her feelings, and she feels that old, primal pain of having her emotional reality denied. But now she knows how to name it. This is the 5-year-old wound being activated. This isn't who I am. It's a part of me that still needs compassion, and instead of acting from the wound, she can hold herself in that moment, can offer herself the nurturing that her mother didn't offer, can validate her own emotional experience, even when others invalidate it. This is what Carl Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the opposites, to be aware of both the wound and the healed self, and to choose to act from the healed self, even when the wound is activated. And that's what transforms the narcissistic wound from a prison into a portal, because when you integrate the shadow, when you rescue that vulnerable part that was buried deep inside, you don't just heal yourself, you become capable of true empathy, of authentic connection, of real intimacy. You become human again. And perhaps that's the profoundest irony about the narcissistic wound. It was created the moment your humanity was judged unacceptable. And it's healed the moment you choose, consciously and repeatedly, to reclaim that humanity, to feel fully, to cry without restraint, to need without shame, to be vulnerable without defenses, not because it's easy, but because it's the only way to come home, to return to the true self that was abandoned so long ago, according to Carl Jung. So, if you grew up hearing that your crying was just a fuss, if you learned that your emotions were overblown, if you were taught that needing nurturing was weakness, know that the message was wrong, not about others, about you. You weren't being dramatic, you were human. Your emotions weren't exaggerated. They were proportionate to the pain you were feeling. Needing emotional validation wasn't weakness. It was the basic right of every vulnerable child. And you can still give yourself permission to feel everything that was forbidden. You can still rescue that part of you that was buried. You can still break the cycle before passing the wound on to the next generation. Carl Jung believed deeply in this capacity for personal transformation. The wound happened. That can't be changed. But what you do with the wound now, that's still in your hands. And now, one last question for you to process. Which of these phrases did you hear most often when you cried as a child? It's nothing. Stop making a fuss. You're exaggerating. Stop being so sensitive. Or the worst of all, complete silence and emotional neglect. Comment down below the exact phrase that marked you, because naming the wound is the first step toward healing it. And seeing that others have gone through the same invalidation will show you that you've never been alone in this pain. Understanding this shared experience is a key tenet of Jungian psychology, emphasizing the collective unconscious.